Chapter 17 is all about Reconstruction in the South, and we're going to look at this chapter in three parts. The first part that you'll hear today is about rebuilding the South. The next parts are the fight over Reconstruction, and then Reconstruction in the South itself. Now, Reconstruction, if you take a look at the pictures that are here, after the war, the government had to rebuild the South. When the soldiers were fighting, and if you remember where they fought primarily, which was in the South, the land was destroyed, the fields were destroyed. If you think about crops were destroyed, cities destroyed. Think of Sherman's March to the Sea and his whole idea of the total war and the destruction he left behind him. People had money. If they had Confederate money, it was now worthless. Railroads, bridges, roads, everything was gone. So the goal was to get the states back into the Union and to rebuild the whole infrastructure that they had. Now, Lincoln had, actually there were two plans for this Reconstruction. The first plan was put out by President Lincoln, and his idea was called the 10% plan, obviously, because he felt that if 10% of the Southerners in each state would swear a loyalty oath to the government, the U.S. government, and those same people needed to agree that slavery was illegal, then that state would be allowed into the Union. Now, he felt this would be a very quick and pretty painless way to get most of the states back, but a lot of people in Congress didn't agree. Now, there were two men, Senator Benjamin Wade and Representative Henry Davis, and these men were kind of at the forefront of the group against Lincoln. They did not think that Lincoln's 10% plan went far enough in punishing the South for what they had done. So they felt Congress needed to control the re-entry of the states to the Union, not the president, and they wanted a plan that was more harsh. They felt that all states had to ban slavery, and everybody, or at least the majority of the men, needed to take the loyalty oath. And they did not want anyone in office in the South, or from the South, that could not take that oath, or who had supported the Confederacy in the past, because they were afraid that then these people, if they rebelled once, they could rebel again. Now, Lincoln, of course, didn't sign this bill. He felt that the southern states would not be able to meet these harsh requirements, so the 10% plan was the one that went forward. Louisiana was actually the first state to sign the 10% plan, and many other states followed. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery in the U.S. It was proposed in January of 1865, but it wasn't passed until December, so almost a year later the states or the government finally ratified this amendment. And if you think of the term amendment, they had to change the Constitution to make slavery illegal. Now, a lot of the abolitionists at the time figured, hey, cool, our work is done, but Frederick Douglass knew better. He knew that until the African Americans or the freedmen had the right to vote, that they technically weren't still considered equal citizens. Now, the image you see here is from Harper's Weekly, and it's a print of what it was like in the State House when this amendment was passed. Now, if you think about all of these changes that came about after the war, there were a lot of challenges and a lot of problems that came with them. Now, when the African Americans were slaves, it was illegal for them to get married. People lived together, they had children, but they could not legally be married. So once slavery was outlawed, a lot of people actually made their unions legal because they were able to now marry each other. The owners in the past had the right to sell off children of slaves that they had, and so many people had to search for their children, or children searching for their parents. Women who used to only be able to work in the fields of the farms were now able to stay home, take care of their families as housewives. People who had missing or had children nearby that they knew were children of relatives were able to adopt them. And there were a lot of churches and volunteer groups that formed to offer aid to many of the freedmen who were now living in the South. People could travel. Before this, they needed specific passes to travel. Now anyone, all the freedmen could travel anywhere they wanted to go. And new last names, if you think about that, slaves had to assume the name of their owner. And so once people were freed, that requirement was no longer there, and so many slaves could then assume a different last name, and many did change their last names. In schools, schools are now built because it was no longer illegal to educate former slaves or African Americans, so many schools were built. Now, the group that helped the most was known as the Freedmen's Bureau, and it was established by the government in 1865. It went probably through the 1870s into the 1880s a little bit, and at its peak there were about 900 people working in the South, and these people did things like distributed food, provided education and legal help, and also built schools and taught in these schools until it was because it was no longer illegal to teach. So the Freedmen's Bureau did a lot of good in helping rebuild the South. Alright, now this is the end of the information from Section 1.